Rosalind Calloway was folding towels in the linen room, the smell of fabric softener and cedar shelving thick in the small space, when her name rang down the hallway like a slap. Rosalind. Now. She set the towel down, squared the stack the way she always did, out of habit more than pride at this point, and walked out to the foyer. Vanessa Pruitt stood at the base of the staircase in a cream silk robe, arms crossed, the morning light catching the diamond on her hand and throwing a small restless spark across the marble floor. "You're done here," Vanessa said. "Pack your things and be gone by 5. Roz didn't move right away. Down the hall, Delia had frozen mid-step with an armful of fresh linens. Near the side door, one of the groundskeepers had gone very still, the way people do when they sense something is about to happen and don't want to be the one who triggers it. "May I ask why?" Roz said, keeping her voice even. "Because I said so. Because this is practically my house now, and I don't want the same girl running around who's been sneaking through Walter's old study." Vanessa's mouth curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Preston mentioned you like to poke through things that aren't yours. Family business. Old records. That's not appropriate for someone who mops floors." Roz felt her face go still, the particular stillness she'd trained into herself over years of managing other people's homes, other people's moods, other people's small cruelties dressed up as instructions. "I was cleaning out a closet," she said. "Mr. Ashford asked me to. Well, now I'm asking you to leave. Get out of this mansion. And don't make a scene." There wasn't going to be a scene. That was the thing Vanessa hadn't figured out about her yet, and probably never would. "I'll get my coat," Roz said. She walked past Delia, who reached out and squeezed her arm once, hard, without a word, the kind of touch that says more than a whole conversation could. In the small back room where the staff kept their bags and their coats and, on cold mornings, a shared thermos of coffee nobody ever admitted to drinking more than their share of, Roz pulled her coat off the hook. Her hands weren't shaking. She'd expected them to. Preston Ashford caught her at the service exit, phone in hand, the kind of tan that came from golf courses instead of yard work. "Vanessa can be a lot," he said, which was as close to sorry as the man would ever get in his life. "I'll have Marcus send 2 weeks severance." "That's generous," Roz said, flat enough that he'd hear exactly what she meant by it. "You were cleaning out Walter's study." "Not a question. Find anything interesting?" Something in his voice made her go still all over again. Not the stillness of holding her temper this time, but the stillness of someone realizing she was standing on ground that mattered more than she'd known 5 minutes earlier. "Old newspapers. A card catalog nobody's touched since the 80s. She shrugged, and it cost her something to make the shrug look easy. "Nothing worth keeping." Preston studied her a beat too long. Then he nodded and stepped aside. She walked out through the kitchen, past the herb garden her grandmother used to tend for this family 30 years ago, past the stone bench under the old oak tree where Odessa Calloway had eaten her lunch alone, every single day for 3 decades, because nobody in that house had ever once thought to invite her to the table. Roz didn't look back. She got in her car, pulled down the long gravel drive, and made it about a mile down the state road before the tears came. She let them. There wasn't anyone around to see, and crying in private had never cost her anything. By the time she reached the main road, she'd stopped. Somewhere between the mansion gates and the first stoplight in town, something in her had shifted from grief into a colder, steadier thing. She thought about turning the car around, walking back in, and telling Vanessa exactly what she thought of her. She thought about telling Preston she knew more than newspapers and card catalogs. But she didn't know, not really, not yet. What she had was a feeling and a box she hadn't opened, sitting under her bed at home, exactly where she'd left it 3 weeks earlier after finally working up the nerve to bring it back from her grandmother's storage unit. She drove straight home instead of anywhere else. There would be time to be furious later. Right now there was a box, $68 in her checking account, and a decision she hadn't let herself make. By the time she pulled into her apartment lot, she'd made it. She wasn't going to let this go. The apartment was small and cold, the kind of cold that came from keeping the thermostat low to save a few dollars a month. Roz dropped her bag by the door and stood in the middle of the living room for a long moment, listening to the refrigerator hum, before she let herself go to the bedroom closet. The tin box was army green, dented at one corner, Calloway scratched into the lid in her grandmother's slanted handwriting. She'd carried it out of the storage unit after the funeral 8 months ago and hadn't been able to open it since. Grief did strange, stubborn things to a person's hands. Tonight she sat down on the edge of the bed and opened it anyway. Inside, photographs curling soft at the edges, a rosary with a worn thumbprint groove in the fifth bead, a stack of letters tied with string gone brittle and pale, a savings passbook from a bank that no longer existed, and folded at the very bottom in a yellowed envelope, a document with an official-looking seal at the top. Roz unfolded it carefully, the paper stiff and dry under her fingers. It was dated 1974. Her eyes moved fast, skimming for names, Odessa Maid Calloway and Walter Ashford, both there, tangled together in language she didn't fully understand. Words like undivided interest, life estate, recorded instrument. A county seal in the corner, faded but legible if she tilted it toward the lamp. She read it 3 times. Then a fourth, slower, mouthing the words this time like that might make them settle into something she could actually hold on to. Her grandmother's name was tied, legally, to that property. Not as staff. As something else entirely. She thought about calling her mother, then remembered, the way grief made you forget for half a second, over and over, in the cruelest possible way, that her mother had died 2 years before Odessa and wouldn't have known anything about this regardless. Odessa had never talked about her years with the Ashfords beyond a few clipped, tired stories about how hard the work was and how little thanks she got for it. Ross turned to the letters next. Odessa and Walter, back and forth across a 2-year stretch in the early 70s. Walter's handwriting started confident and grew shakier in the later ones. He'd been sick, it seemed, sicker than the family apparently cared to deal with themselves, and Odessa had stayed on past her hours, past what any housekeeper owed anybody, nursing a man through something his own children hadn't wanted to touch. One letter near the bottom of the stack broke the pattern completely, typed, formal, on attorney letterhead, the kind of paper that meant business. In consideration of services rendered and to ensure the continued security of Miss Calloway and her descendants, the undersigned has recorded the attached instrument with the county recorder's office this 14th day of March, 1974. Signed by Walter Ashford. Witnessed by an attorney Roz didn't recognize, a name that meant nothing to her now but that she suspected might mean something soon. She sat with that a long time, the apartment growing darker around her as the sun went down, and she didn't bother getting up to turn on a light. Rent was due in 9 days. She had $68 and no job. And somewhere in this box was proof that her grandmother had been promised something real enough to be filed with the county, and it had never once been mentioned to her family in 50 years. For one shameful second, she let herself imagine what the document might be worth if she just sold it, quietly, to a collector, or handed it back to the family themselves in exchange for whatever they'd pay to make it disappear. Enough for a few months' rent, maybe more. The thought made her stomach turn almost immediately, a physical recoil she didn't have to think twice about. Odessa hadn't kept this hidden for 50 years so her granddaughter could cash it in for grocery money the first hard month that came along. She called Delia, mostly because she needed to hear another human voice in the dark apartment. "They fired you and you found what?" Delia said, her voice tinny through the phone speaker. "I don't know exactly. That's the problem. I need somebody who actually understands this stuff to look at it properly." "Marcus," Delia said after a pause. "He's handled all the Ashford business for years. He'll know what it is even if he doesn't want to tell you the truth about it." Roz didn't love the idea of walking into the family's own lawyer's office, hat in hand, but she also didn't know another attorney, and there wasn't time to find one. She'd overheard enough kitchen gossip over the years, the kind that floats around a big house when the family forgets the staff has ears, to know the Ashfords were trying to sell the mansion and fast. Something about Preston's business being underwater. If a sale went through and this document mattered even a little, she needed to know before it was too late for it to matter at all. She put the folder carefully back in the tin box and set the box on her kitchen table, where she'd see it first thing in the morning before coffee, before anything else could crowd it out of her head. For the first time all day, she let herself sit still with the full shape of what she was about to do. She was going to find out exactly what her grandmother had left her. And she was going to find out before that house sold out from under the truth. Marcus Feld's office sat on the second floor of an old brick building downtown, brass nameplate on the door, a receptionist who looked like she'd worked there since the Reagan administration and had opinions about everyone who walked through. Roz had called ahead, half expecting to be brushed off, and had been mildly surprised when he'd agreed to see her the next morning. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the kind of office that smelled like old paper and stronger coffee than the pot in the break room ever managed to produce. He shook her hand and waved her into the leather chair across from a desk stacked in orderly towers of folders. Delia mentioned you had something you wanted looked at, he said. Ross slid the folder across the desk. My grandmother worked for the Ashford family. Walter Ashford back in the 70s. I found this in her things after she passed. Marcus put his glasses down and unfolded the document. Roz watched his face the way she'd learned to watch faces over years of managing other people's houses. Not the words but the hands, the eyes, the small tells that gave a room away before anyone opened their mouth. His hands went still on the paper. His eyes moved fast back and forth, exactly the way hers had the night before. Where did you say you found this? He asked without looking up from the page. My grandmother's storage unit. She passed in the spring. I'm sorry for your loss. Automatic, the way people say things when their mind's already 3 steps ahead of the conversation. He set the document down and folded his hands over it, almost like he was covering it or protecting it from her or from himself. This is old. Very old. I'd need to review our complete file before I could tell you what it means, if it means anything at all. A lot can happen to a piece of paper like this over 50 years. But it's real, Ross said. It was filed with the county. I didn't say it wasn't real. His voice had a careful, practiced evenness to it now, the tone of a man choosing every word like it might come back to bite him later. These things get complicated. There could have been a release, a subsequent transfer, any number of things that would make this moot today. I wouldn't want to give you false hope over something that might not matter anymore. I'm not asking for hope. I'm asking what it says. Marcus looked at her for a long moment, and something crossed his face she couldn't quite name. Not guilt exactly, not fear exactly, but somewhere close to both. The expression of a man watching a debt he'd hoped never to pay walk into his office and sit down in the chair across from him. Let me hold on to this a few days, he said. Let me look into it properly. I'll call you. I'd rather keep the original, Ross said, and reached for the folder before he could argue his way into keeping it. She wasn't naive enough to hand the only copy of anything over to a man who'd worked for the family that had just fired her that morning. But you're welcome to make a copy if you need one. His jaw tightened just slightly, but he nodded and walked it to the copier himself rather than hand it off to his assistant, which told her something too. When he came back, he handed her the original along with his own copy, tucked into a fresh folder. I'll be in touch, he said. Soon. Roz left his office with more questions than she'd walked in with. His reaction had told her something the document itself never could. Whatever this was, it mattered enough to make a man who'd spent 30 years keeping his composure around wealthy clients go careful and quiet in the space of 2 minutes. She wasn't 10 minutes down the road, stopped at a red light with the radio playing something she wasn't really hearing, when her phone buzzed with a text from Delia. Preston just called the house looking for you. Wanted to know if you'd found anything of interest in Walter's study before you left. Sounded weird. You okay? Roz stared at the screen until the light turned green behind her and the car behind hers gave a short, impatient tap of its horn. Marcus had called Preston within minutes of her walking out his door. Whatever was sitting in that tin box, the Ashford family already knew it existed. And now they knew without question that she had it too. The invitation came 2 days later, not from Marcus but directly from Preston, a text asking her to come by the estate, to settle things properly. Roz almost didn't go. In the end she went anyway because staying home turning it over in her head felt worse than whatever waited for her at that house. Preston received her in his study, the same room she'd been cleaning out the day she was fired, the same shelves, the same faint smell of old leather and pipe tobacco that had never quite aired out. He'd poured 2 glasses of something amber-colored and pushed one toward her, which he left untouched on the edge of the desk. I understand you found some old paperwork, he said, settling into the chair across from her with the easy posture of a man used to controlling a room. Marcus mentioned it. Family history's a strange thing to stumble onto during a closet clean-out. It's not just family history, Ross said. It has my grandmother's name on a legal filing. Preston's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes did, just for a flicker. My father was an eccentric man in his later years. He made all kinds of promises to all kinds of people. Not all of them held up. This one was filed with the county. Lots of things get filed that don't mean what people hope they mean. He leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. Look, Rosalind, Ross, is it? I don't want this to be difficult. Your grandmother worked for this family a long time, and whatever my father intended, I'd like to make sure her granddaughter isn't left out in the cold over an old misunderstanding. I'm prepared to offer you $15,000. A settlement. Clean, simple, and it gives you a real cushion while you find your next position. $15,000 was more money than Roz had seen in one place in her entire adult life. For a half second, sitting in that study with her rent 9 days overdue and her bank account down to double digits, she let herself picture what it would mean: 3 months of not counting every dollar, a car repair she'd been putting off for a year, a real security deposit somewhere better than where she was now. Then she thought about her grandmother eating lunch alone under that oak tree for 30 years, never once invited to the family table, never once thanked by name in front of company. "Why would you offer me that much money for a piece of paper you say doesn't mean anything?" she asked. Preston's jaw ticked, just slightly, a small crack in the polish. "Call it goodwill." "I'd like some time to think about it," Roz said, which wasn't strictly true. She already knew her answer sitting deep in her chest, but she wanted to see what he'd do with more rope rather than less. "Of course." He stood, the meeting clearly over as far as he was concerned. But something in his face had changed in the last few minutes. He'd shown her more than he'd meant to. A man offering $15,000 for a piece of paper that supposedly meant nothing wasn't a man being generous. He was a man who was scared and doing a middling job of hiding it. Driving home, she called Grant, mostly out of habit. She'd known him casually for years working in his family's house, and he'd always been the decent one, the one who said thank you and actually meant it, who remembered her name without having to be reminded. She hadn't planned on telling him anything, but when he picked up and asked how she was holding up after everything with Vanessa, something in the genuine worry in his voice made her want to trust him just a little. "Can I ask you something strange?" she said. "Did you know your grandfather made some kind of arrangement with my grandmother? Back in the 70s? There was a pause on the line, long enough that she thought the call had dropped. "I don't know anything about that," Grant finally said. "What? What's going on?" "I'm not sure yet," Roz said. "I'll tell you when I am." She hung up before he could press further. She wasn't ready to trust anyone in that family completely, not even the one who might actually deserve it. The county recorder's office was on the 3rd floor of an old municipal building downtown, all fluorescent light and worn linoleum tile, the kind of place where time seemed to move slower out of sheer institutional habit. Roz stood at the counter for 20 minutes before a clerk finally called her number. "I'm looking for a record from 1974, she said, sliding a slip of paper across with the document number she'd copied carefully from her grandmother's file. "I want to know if it's still active. If it was ever released or transferred." The clerk, a woman in her 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, typed for a while, frowned at her screen, typed again. "That's an old one. Give me a minute. We've got to pull the physical book for anything pre-85. Roz waited nearly 45 minutes on a hard plastic chair, watching a slow parade of other people come and go with their own pieces of paper, their own small emergencies. A young couple arguing quietly over a property line, an older man in a mechanic's uniform filling out something in triplicate with visible frustration. When the clerk finally returned, she had a photocopy in her hand and a look on her face like she'd found something worth mentioning. "Here you go. Recorded March 14, 1974. It's still on the books. I don't see any release, any satisfaction, any subsequent instrument that would cancel it out. As far as the county's concerned, this is still active." Roz's hands weren't steady when she took the paper. "What does that mean exactly? What is it?" The clerk glanced at the document again, tracing a finger along a line of text. "Looks like an undivided fractional interest in the real property described here. That address matches up to a parcel out on Ridgeline Road. Whoever's name is on this has a legal ownership stake in that property. Not the whole thing. A piece of it. But it's real and it's never been undone." Roz stood very still in the middle of the recorder's office, the fluorescent light humming overhead, and felt the entire shape of the last 2 weeks rearrange itself around her, quietly and completely. This wasn't a sentimental keepsake. This wasn't a story her grandmother had simply never gotten around to telling. This was a legal fact that had sat quietly in a county file cabinet for 50 years while an entire family built their comfortable lives on top of a house that wasn't fully theirs to sell. And they were trying to sell it. In 8 days, if the timeline Delia had overheard through the kitchen door was right. Roz got the certified copy stamped and paid for, $12 she genuinely couldn't afford to spare, and walked out into the parking lot, where she sat in her car for a long time before she trusted herself to drive. She thought about calling Marcus, but he'd already shown her which side of this he was standing on. She thought about calling Preston, but there was nothing left to negotiate about a $15,000 settlement now that she understood exactly what he was trying to buy his way out of. Instead, she called nobody. She sat with the certified copy resting in her lap and let herself feel, for the first time since she'd opened that tin box, something that wasn't grief or confusion but something closer to clarity, a hard, clean, steady thing settling into place. Her grandmother hadn't left her money. She'd left her the truth, filed and stamped and impossible to quietly erase, and it had been sitting there the whole time, patient, waiting for somebody to finally walk into that office and ask the right question. Roz drove home with a new plan taking shape, one that didn't involve $15,000 or disappearing quietly into a story people would eventually forget. If the sale was happening in 8 days, then in 8 days she was going to be standing in that room. The blacklisting didn't announce itself with a phone call or a letter. It just showed up quietly, in the form of doors that used to open now staying shut without explanation. Roz applied to 3 housekeeping agencies that week, all places she'd worked with before, places that had always been glad to place her on short notice. 2 never called back at all, which was its own kind of answer. The third, run by a woman named Carol who'd known Roz for 6 years and had always spoken to her like a real person instead of a line item, called and was strange on the phone, apologetic, vague, talking about a hiring freeze that hadn't existed the week before. "Somebody told you something," Roz said finally, tired of dancing around the edges of it. Carol was quiet for a second, and Roz could hear her exhale, long and unhappy. "Preston Ashford's on our board of advisors, hon. I got a call. I'm sorry. I really am. You've always done good work for us and I hate this." Roz hung up and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time afterward, staring at nothing in particular. She understood, with a kind of cold clarity, exactly what Preston was doing. He couldn't make the document disappear, the county had already confirmed that. He couldn't buy her silence outright, not now that she'd already turned down $15,000 once. So instead he was making sure she had nothing left to lose except the fight itself. No income, no references, nothing but a certified copy of a 50-year-old deed and a stubbornness that was starting to feel less like courage and more like standing alone in a room that was slowly filling with smoke. Grant showed up at her apartment 2 days later, which surprised her. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in some time, dark circles under his eyes, his usual careful composure fraying at the edges. "My father told me you're trying to blow up the sale," he said, standing in her doorway, not quite meeting her eyes. "Something about an old document. He says you're trying to shake us down." "Is that what he called it?" "Roz, I don't know what to think. He's my father. He's never lied to me about something this big before." Grant ran a hand through his hair, a nervous, unfamiliar gesture on him. "Is it true? Did my grandfather really promise your grandmother part of the house?" "He didn't promise anything," Roz said. "He filed it, legally, with the county, 50 years ago. And your father's known about it this whole time, because Marcus Feld called him within 10 minutes of me walking into his office 2 weeks ago." Grant didn't say anything to that right away. Whatever he'd come here to say, whatever version of the story he'd been carrying with him from his father's study, it visibly, painfully didn't line up with what she'd just told him. "I need to think," he said finally, and left without another word. That night, Roz sat at her kitchen table with the tin box open in front of her. The photographs, the letters, the rosary, all of it laid out like evidence in a trial only she seemed to be attending. She thought again about the $15,000. How easy it would be to call Preston back and take it, to let this house and this family fade slowly into a story she used to tell about her grandmother, back before things got complicated. She picked up one of the letters instead, the one where Walter Ashford, sick and scared and finally plainly honest, had written, "You are the only person in this house who has ever treated me like a man instead of a bank account. I don't know how to thank you properly, so I'm going to try to do it the only way that will last." Odessa had kept that letter for 50 years. She'd never cashed it in, never used it as leverage, never even told her own daughter it existed. She'd just kept it, folded carefully, tucked away, like she was waiting for the right moment, or the right person, to finally do something with it. Roz folded the letter back up and set it gently aside. She wasn't going to be the person who let it disappear now, after everything. The cemetery was quiet on a Tuesday morning, Just Roz and the groundskeeper working somewhere near the maintenance shed on the far side. She hadn't visited in a few months, not out of avoidance exactly, just the particular way life crowds out grief until grief finds its own way back into a person, usually at the worst possible time. She sat on the grass beside the headstone, feeling the cool damp of the morning through her jeans, and didn't say anything for a while. "I don't know what you would have wanted me to do with this," she finally said, quiet enough that even the groundskeeper across the lawn couldn't have heard her. "Take the money and disappear, maybe? You spent your whole life not asking for anything from anyone. Maybe that's what you'd want for me too. Just take the 15,000 and go be safe somewhere quiet." The wind moved through the trees overhead, scattering a few early leaves across the grass. Roz thought about Walter Ashford's letter, about a man finally telling the truth after decades of careful silence, and about how her grandmother had never once used that truth to make her own life a single degree easier. "But I don't think that's what you'd want," Roz said. "I think you kept it because you wanted somebody to finally say it out loud. So I'm going to say it out loud on your behalf if nothing else." She drove home with something settled in her chest that hadn't been there before. Not certainty about how things would turn out, not exactly, but certainty about what she was going to do next regardless. She called Marcus first, and to her mild surprise, he answered on the second ring. "The closing's in 3 days," she said without preamble. "I want you to tell me the truth about what you know, or I want you to tell me you won't, so I know exactly where I stand walking in there." There was a long silence on the line, long enough that she could hear the faint sound of him breathing, thinking. "Rosalind, I've worked for this family a long time." "That's not an answer." "I know," Marcus said quietly, and there was something almost tired in his voice. "I know it isn't." She didn't push further. She'd learned enough about the man in 2 short conversations to know that pushing wouldn't move him, but something underneath his voice told her he hadn't made his peace with whatever he was carrying either. Next she called Grant. "I'm going to be at the closing," she told him, direct and unhurried. "I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you because I'd rather you hear it from me than be blindsided in the room." "Roz, I'm not trying to destroy your family," she said. "I'm trying to finish something my grandmother started 50 years ago and never got to see through to the end. What you do with that information from here is up to you." There was a pause, and then Grant said something she hadn't expected at all. "I looked through some of my grandfather's old files this week. There's a folder Marcus kept locked in storage, correspondence mostly from what I could tell through the glass door. I haven't opened it yet. I think I need to." "Then open it," Roz said. "Before Thursday." She spent her last full day before the closing doing something she hadn't let herself do properly yet, reading through every single letter in the tin box, slowly in order, building the complete timeline of what had actually happened between her grandmother and Walter Ashford year by year, season by season. By the time she finished, the light outside had gone from afternoon gold to evening blue, and she understood the whole shape of it. Care given freely with no expectation of anything back, gratitude that had nowhere else in that family to go, and a rich man's clumsy, sincere, last-ditch attempt to make something right before he ran out of time to do it. She wasn't walking into that closing room to punish anyone, and she needed to remember that clearly going in. She was walking in to finish what her grandmother had started and never got to see land. The conference room at Calloway Title Company was too bright, all fluorescent light and a long table with too many empty chairs pushed in around it. Preston sat at the head, sharp in a gray suit. Vanessa sat beside him in a pale blue dress, her hair done up like this was already a celebration. Grant sat across the table looking like he hadn't slept in days. Marcus sat at the far end with a worn leather folder in front of him that he hadn't opened yet. The closing agent, a tired-looking man named Terence with reading glasses low on his nose, was halfway through explaining the wire transfer schedule in a flat, practiced monotone when Roz walked in through the glass door. Vanessa's face went through several things in quick succession. Surprise, then contempt, then something closer to alarm as she registered that nobody in the room was moving to stop her. "You can't be here," Vanessa said, her voice climbing. "I have every right to be here," Roz said, and set a folder down on the polished table between them. "This closing can't legally go through without my signature." Preston's composure cracked, visibly for the first time since Roz had known him. "This is absurd. Terence, please ignore this, she doesn't have any standing here whatsoever." Terence, to his credit, picked up the folder without asking permission and started reading, his eyebrows lifting slowly as he moved through the first page. "This is a certified county record," he said, glancing up over his glasses. "If this interest is still active, I can't legally process this closing. I'd need it resolved first, one way or another." "It's 50 years old," Preston said, his voice rising now too. "It's meaningless. My father made all kinds of arrangements with all kinds of people in his later years, when his mind wasn't entirely. It was never released," Ross said, cutting through him. "Steady?" "I checked. The county checked. There's no satisfaction filed, no subsequent transfer, nothing at all that cancels it out. It's still on the books, exactly as it was written in 1974. This is a shakedown." Vanessa stood up so fast her chair scraped hard against the floor. "She's the maid. She probably forged this whole thing too." "Vanessa." Grant's voice, low but firm enough to stop her cold. "Sit down." Marcus finally opened his folder. His hands, Roz noticed from across the table, were not quite steady, and for the first time since she'd met him, he didn't look like a man in control of the room. "I need to say something," he said, and the whole room seemed to go still around him, even the hum of the air conditioning suddenly noticeable in the silence. "I've represented this family for 18 years. When Miss Calloway came to my office 2 weeks ago, I recognized this document immediately, because I've known about it the entire time. Preston asked me to make sure it never surfaced. I should have told her the truth that day in my office. I didn't. I'm telling her now, in front of everyone, because I should have a long time ago." "Marcus." Preston's voice had gone low and dangerous. "It's real, Preston," Marcus said, and there was something almost like relief threaded through his voice now, the sound of a man finally setting down something heavy he'd been carrying much too long. "It was real in 1974 and it's real today, and no amount of pretending otherwise is going to make it disappear. I let you talk me into hiding it once, years ago, and I've regretted it every day since. I'm not doing it a second time." The room was silent except for the steady hum of the air conditioning overhead. "So what happens now?" Grant finally asked, looking toward Terrence, his voice quiet. "Now," Terrence said, closing his laptop with a soft click, "the sale doesn't close today. Not until this is sorted out between all parties involved, with actual legal counsel representing Miss Calloway's interests properly. I'd suggest everyone in this room take a breath before anyone says another word." Preston sat very still, his jaw working, looking older in that moment than he had 10 minutes before, like something in him had finally deflated. Vanessa had gone quiet too, her earlier fury replaced by something colder and more calculating. The sudden, unwelcome understanding that the marriage she'd built her plans around now had a very large, very public question mark hanging directly over the middle of it. Roz gathered her folder slowly, unhurried. "I'm not trying to take your house," she said to Preston, quiet enough that only the people closest to her could hear it. "I just wasn't going to let you sell it out from under the truth." She left the room before anyone could think of an answer. The negotiations took another 6 weeks. Roz hired her own attorney, a young woman named Priya who took the case for a modest retainer and an unmistakable glint of enjoyment at the prospect of going up against Marcus Feld's old, established firm. In the end, the fractional interest was valued and settled properly, not a mansion, not a fortune, but a fair buyout, enough to cover 2 years of rent, pay off her car outright, and leave over just enough for her to finally open the small alterations shop she'd been quietly dreaming about since she was 22 years old, back when dreaming about it had felt like the safest place to keep it. The sale of the mansion went through eventually, to a different buyer entirely, at a price that meant Preston had to sell off 2 of his rental properties and step back from the larger business deal that had put him underwater in the first place. He never called Roz to apologize. She hadn't expected him to, not really, and had made her peace with that somewhere around week 4 of the negotiations. Vanessa's wedding happened, smaller than originally planned, at a venue nowhere near as grand as the mansion would have been. Roz heard about it secondhand, from Delia, over coffee one Sunday afternoon, and felt surprisingly little about it. Not triumph exactly, not pity either, just the quiet indifference of someone who'd moved on to a life that no longer orbited that family or its dramas. Grant came by her new shop once, a few months after it opened, the bell over the door announcing him before she even looked up. He glanced around at the little space, sewing machines humming, bolts of fabric stacked in careful color order, morning light coming through the front window, and didn't say much at first, just stood there taking it in. "She would have liked this," he finally said. "I think so too," Roz said, and meant it. He left an envelope on the counter before he went, not saying anything more about it, and inside was one of the old photographs from Walter Ashford's study, Odessa, young, laughing at something just outside the frame, decades before any of this had ever begun. A note on the back in Grant's careful handwriting read, "Found this in my grandfather's things. Thought it belonged with you." Roz framed the photograph that same evening and hung it on the wall of her shop, right beside the empty tin box, its lid still scratched with Calloway in her grandmother's careful, patient hand. She didn't get the mansion. She didn't get an apology or a reconciliation, or a fairy tale ending where the family she'd once served finally, warmly saw her as one of their own. What she got instead was smaller and sturdier than any of that, proof finally spoken out loud in a room full of people who couldn't pretend not to hear it, that her grandmother had mattered, and a name of her own on a piece of paper that nobody could quietly erase again. She locked up the shop that evening, flipped the little sign in the window to closed, and walked out into the ordinary, unremarkable evening of a life that was, for the first time in a long while, entirely her own to build. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more, and let us know down in the comments what part hit you the hardest. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that the truth doesn't stay buried forever.